Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we are going to talk about a novel with a single word title. I like that economy. That word is wash. The author's name, and this is true, is Margaret Wrinkle. And her book is published by Atlantic Monthly Press, and we thank you for taking time to stop by.
Thank you for having me.
You know, this book has a number of extraordinary things about it, in my opinion. It includes, for example, how you came to write it in the first place, a kind of rumor about one of your ancestors, in a sense, got you started, didn't it?
Yes.
And what happened? Well, first of all, what was the rumor?
Well, being a seventh-generation Southerner, being from Alabama, I knew that I had slaveholding ancestors. And I sensed there might be a connection between that and all the race reconciliation work I was doing. But then I stumbled across a rumor that an ancestor of mine may have been involved in the breeding of enslaved people. And so I started digging into that. I never found any proof of that allegation. I could hardly find any historical evidence of the practice at all. But that's what pushed me into fiction. Because the research trail ran dry, you might say. It ran dry pretty close to the beginning. So.
But you weren't willing to give up the project, in a sense. You still wanted to understand this business.
Well, I think I started thinking I would write nonfiction, but then without any paper trail or proof, then I went into fiction. So, and I decided, regardless of, I didn't find any proof of the allegation, and I have no way of knowing whether he did or didn't, but once I found out that people did, and they had people, he could have been connected to me. And I knew that connection would make the story more vital. So.
And the act or the activity that we're talking about here is the breeding of slaves in country, that is, in the United States, rather than importing them, as it were, from Africa.
Right.
What were the advantages to that approach rather than importing?
Well, the trade was legally ended in 1808, and so there were rogue ships coming in, but there were no more. The stream of imports was cut off by that law in 1808, and there was a lot of population moving into the newly opened Western territories, and a lot of the enslaved people were in Virginia and that area where the land was sort of worn out. So there was this movement west and this demand for slaves on the western edge. So
that's how the business of inbreeding.
Well, I don't really know. That's my
that's your assumption.
That's my was my operating principle. So,
and one of the other things that's unusual, I think, about the book is that you chose to write it with several different voices. At least some of them are voices of the enslaved. What pushed you in that direction? Well,
that's just sort of how it happened. I started trying to center the story around this ancestor, this fictional character inspired by this ancestor of mine. He was really a composite of a lot of the white men that were on the frontier at that time trying to build their empires. And so I was centering around him because that was my story, the one I had a connection to, the one I had a right to write about. Mm-hmm. But then when I found a 3-line quote from a survivor of slavery about a man who was used as what they then called a traveling Negro, when I saw that 3-line quote describing that man, and I started thinking about him, Wash's voice just took over. And he took over the book. And then it was a matter of discovering his story and weaving it in with Richardson's, the owner.
And you also then bring in other voices, which I think has a very interesting result, at least did for me as a reader. And that is that reading the book is an extraordinary experience because it's more like sitting around the table or a campfire and hearing a story. And then George says, "Nah, Bill, that's not really the way it happened. Let me tell you exactly what happened. And then he goes on with his version of the story, and on it goes throughout the book. And the result of that for me as a reader was a sense of, I'm not reading a book. I'm sitting and I'm getting an immediate experience of something that has happened, and that it's important. And that's why it's being told to me again and again and again. So I really think it's great.
Well, I'm so glad that was working for you. I felt like I heard them, and I've also grew up hearing people talk about each other and tell conflicting stories about what happened. That's what it is to grow up in a segregated place. That's how it is. Different people telling different stories about the same things. I
hadn't thought about that, but by God, that's got to be true. I had a fellow from Alabama, not Birmingham, from the very southern tip of Alabama, in some of my classes in graduate school, and he was very, very cautious to come to a conclusion. Let's hear something else, and so it was. Well, listen, enough of the backstory, okay? When we come back, let's talk about the title character, Wash.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Wash. That's the title of the book. If you weren't paying attention, you'd go on and on. It doesn't go on and on. The title of the novel we're talking about today is Wash. The author, Margaret Wrinkle, is with us. The publisher is Atlantic Monthly Press. And Sina Jeter Naslin has had something quite wonderful to say about it. Sina is the author of Ahab's Wife, Four Spirits, Abundance, and Adam and Eve. So she's done a little bit of work. She says, boldly conceived and brilliantly written, Margaret Wrinkle's Wash reveals the horrible human predation. I had to look that word up. Fascinating word. Predation, the human predation of slavery and its nest of nightmares. With a truthfulness even beyond Faulkner, Wrinkle makes her novelistic debut. So, Sina, let's get this. This is the first novel. You could call it that. Wrinkle, in her first novel, has written a monumental work of unflinching imagination. Probably shouldn't tell her that I did that. End the friendship. The business of those nightmares, slavery and its nest of nightmares, that's an awfully good expression. Because every one of the slave characters, I think, in the novel has nightmares, and some of them get the chance to tell them, and some of them don't. But it's the way they live.
Well, and it's not just the enslaved characters. The slave owners have nightmares as well.
Well, that's true.
I think what was interesting to me was that a lot of the slave owners, it was kind of a slow motion war that went on for hundreds of years, where one group of people is trying to control another group of people. And so that what that meant was that the owners never knew quite exactly what was brewing, what was going to happen, what could happen, and that produced a state of uncertainty that I think has affected the white psyche for generations in the South. So
yeah, that unannounced war that you're talking about, you get across very well, I think, by the way you tell the stories of the cruelty involved. What they, how they had to live on those ships coming in from Africa, the kinds of punishment that they were subject to once they got here, and the kind of deprivation from things that might have enhanced their lives. That they were really treated as animals, I guess.
Well, I mean, the thing that I was most interested in was the reaction to that treatment, the insistence on the refusal to be dehumanized, and the way that treatment was met with such sort of creativity
Well, one of the ways it was met, I think, is that they maintained and continued to increase, my guess is, their spiritual life, their sense of the spiritual, which comes through here page after page. The way mother treats son, the way, quote, father treats the younger ones. And it's all based on the spirituality of Africa, isn't it?
Yes, yes. The traditional West African spirituality, half of the characters come from a traditional ceremonial reality. And so, and I think much more of that way of being and thinking was carried over than we tend to think. And I mean, even just growing up in the South in the 60s and 70s, it's once I started studying West African tradition and culture, I saw how African the South that I grew up in is and still is. So it's an interesting blend.
Well, this story is set in the summer of 1823, and then it goes back to the summer of 1812 and returns to 1823. One of the main characters, a man by the name of Richardson, whom I think of as a two-war hero, has fallen on hard times and turns to this slave breeding business in order to survive, which right away made me feel some kind of sympathy for him. He didn't do it out of meanness or brutality, although those things were involved in it. It was in order to survive.
Well, he was to get out of debt. He was in debt. He had big dreams. He wanted to found a city on a hill. He wanted to build an empire, and those dreams had gotten him up to his eyeballs in debt. So,
oh, well, my goodness. I still have my boob.
He needed a way out.
Yeah. And one of there's a term that you use, or you have Richardson use, that I don't understand. He uses it quite often. And that phrase is fineness. Fineness. You talk about the fact that he can still catch glimpses of Mena's fineness in Wash. Mena being Wash's mother.
Mina, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mina, excuse me. And what is this fineness?
Well, I mean, he talks about it also in terms of quality.
Okay.
Because, he's been breeding horses. He's been building things. And when he engages in this breeding endeavor, he wants to make something of quality. And what's happened with Wash, even though Richardson owned Mina initially, and but by the time he gets Mina and Wash back, Wash has had a number of encounters with some. He's pretty damaged by his run-ins with various slave owners in his teenage years, and so it's sort of the unbroken quality of how he was before he had these run-ins with fights that he had.
Guess what? We didn't get to Wash, but we promise we will get to Wash when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
We are talking about a novel called Wash. It is written by Margaret Wrinkle. It's her first novel, I understand. Is it not? Yes. And it's published by Atlantic Monthly Press. And though it's her first novel, it has received lots of praise. Among the praisers is one, Malidoma Patrice Sommet. Did I do that one correct?
Yes.
You get people with more common names next time, unlike,
I'll see what I can do.
Jimmy Jones or Paul Bruce, that kind of thing. Malidoma says, Wrinkle masterfully takes us on a powerful journey through the darkest past and present of the country. boldly addressing the chasm of racial divide with the scalpel of a gruesome truth. Wash is the epitome of courage and determination to heal the central wound of this culture. And you do. You do try. That's all we can expect of novelists, you know.
It's a big job. It's not. It's a big job that I think will go on for a very long time.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, and a lot of people have tried.
Yes,
and suffered for it. Richardson, I was fascinated by him, and the way he summed up his life at one point is very sad, but I think very on point. I feel more connected, he says, to the horses I've raised, the Negroes I've owned, and the accounts I've tended, than to my wife and most of my children.
Yep.
You know, there's something so powerful about that and so current. I mean, a lot of men reach that point. They've done so well in the business area, the career area, and the big thing is right in front of them, and then they tend to miss it.
Well, he's a very isolated character in a lot of. He supposedly has a lot of power in this situation, but he's quite isolated.
Yeah, he has no friends left. Actually, everybody else is pretty much gone away. Let's talk a little bit about our friend Wash. Now, Wash, among other things, he's physically beautiful, strong, capable of doing a lot of different things besides the task that Richardson sets for him. He becomes what's called, and this is almost like a euphemism, isn't it, is traveling Negro. What does that really mean that he's doing? Well,
that was the word they used for these men that were used as breeding sires. They were sent around to different plantations because it wasn't a very safe job, because this person was put with people who had people. And so I would imagine that there would be a lot of people who didn't like this person. And so they would send them around to distant places, and then they would come and then they would leave. And so that's why they were called traveling Negroes. And there's another word, stockman, that was used for that.
And there would be a transfer of money between the owners.
Yes, for the services.
For the services. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sure takes an awful lot out of sexuality, doesn't it? For the services. Now, despite being employed in that way, Wash is a philosopher, I think. Yes. His thoughts on life in one place. Life comes over me in waves, he says, with the bad and the good twinned tight together, making me take all of it or none. And what I do know, I can't stay here without nothing at all. That's like a plant stuck in his little patch of dirt with rain just too uncertain. So he's got to do different things, and he's got to accept the context in which he lives. And he's a hero. That's all there is to it. He's dealing with a very complicated situation with a great deal of integrity and grace, and sort of his metaphorical thinking was what interested me so much about him. He's great. He's a great, great character. Thank you. One of the other people in the book that I really, really admired is the Smithy. And his name is? Rufus. Rufus. Could you read a little bit about Rufus for us, please? Yes. Rufus is a West African metalsmith who was captured as a young man in West Africa. And the Smiths were priests, a kind of priest, because they made the things that were used in ceremony. But now he makes chains and shackles and the R brand for runaway. And also the person who did circumcisions. Yes, they were the ones who did the circumcisions in ceremony in Africa. Okay. But he has made an R brand for runaway that will be used on those who've been running away. This R brand calls out Rufus's name, just like everything else he makes.
There's a liquid grace to the shapes he coaxes from his iron. Everybody's work looks a little different. Some is taste and choosing, but most is in the rise and fall of one man's hammer, as individual as a fingerprint. No matter whether he's making workaday hooks and hinges or fancier specialty items like fire screens or candlesticks, the way Rufus works his metal makes his pieces look like water moving, and the boys can charge more for his work than any of the rest of them can charge for theirs. Even this R is a river, hooking around to loop back on itself, and the leg of this R kicks up at its tip, looking like nothing so much as the foot on a leg running. Rufus does this part on purpose. That foot kicking up is his way of saying good luck, safe passage, and God be with you. Those who get Rufus's R laid on their face can finger the scar, and when they reach that foot at the end of their R, they'll think about the next time. They'll feel their own legs running hard through brush and swamp, carrying them right on out of there, the whole way. Eli rides through the yard calling for Rufus as he passes by his door, asking has he got it done yet, saying hurry up, we're headed out. Rufus walks out of his shop carrying his file in one hand and the new brand in the other. The letter is still cooling from orange, so he holds the brand halfway down its shaft with a thick grimy rag so he won't burn himself. Ain't cleaned up good yet. Don't need to be perfect so long as we can read it. We got 3 to do over at Henderson's. Said he might shoot the one who started it, so we'll do a trial run on him. See how it turns out. Rufus had already told them he has too much work to ride with them, even though it's usually him who does the branding. He has a reputation for being quick and careful. But he's staying here today, so he carries the new brand over to where Eli sits on his horse, waiting for his brother. Rufus likes that the brand's still hot as he hands it up to Eli, who has forgotten his gloves in his rush.
And he does hand it up to Eli, and it is red hot. And Eli does not have gloves, and something that you might expect happen will happen. What that is, you're going to have to buy the book to find out. Again, the book is called Wash. The author is Margaret Wrinkle, publisher Atlantic Monthly Press. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.